Amara Bennett adjusted the strap of her black leather handbag, its polished silver buckle catching the early Chicago sunlight as she stepped into Boulevard Bean. Her heels echoed softly on the tiled floor as the familiar scent of espresso and cinnamon filled her senses, a small comfort before what promised to be a taxing day. Her mind was already racing, court briefs, case reviews, and a late-night prep session for an upcoming civil rights lawsuit against the city. But for now, all she needed was her usual, an extra hot caramel macchiato. The cafe buzzed with its typical morning crowd, professionals grabbing their caffeine fix before the city's heartbeat kicked into full gear. Amara glanced at her watch, 7:43 a.m. If the barista was quick, she'd be back in her car by 7:50, just in time to beat the worst of rush hour. Her thoughts drifted to her growing workload, her mind flipping through the day's priorities, when a sharp voice cut through the low murmur of conversation. "Mom, hands where we can see them." The command was so sudden that the room fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. Amara's heart raced. She hesitated, certain the officer wasn't speaking to her. But as she turned, the breath caught in her throat. Two uniformed police officers stormed toward her. The taller one, a white man with a buzz cut, had his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. Beside him, a stockier officer with a reddish beard clutched a pair of steel handcuffs, his jaw locked in grim determination. "Me?" Amara's voice cracked, disbelief thick in her throat. "Hands up now." The buzz-cut officer's voice was sharper this time, drawing every eye in the cafe. Her lawyer's instincts kicked in. Comply now, argue later. With measured calm, Amara raised her hands, though her fingers trembled. "I'm sorry, what's going on?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the growing dread twisting in her gut. The bearded officer closed the distance between them. His grip was rough as he yanked her wrist behind her back. "You match the description of a suspect. You need to come with us." A jolt of shock ran through her. "I just walked in for coffee." The buzz-cut officer snapped the cold cuffs around her wrists with practiced ease. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The cafe was deathly silent, save for the whispers that snaked around the room. Amara could feel the stares, some shocked, others smug, as phones lifted into the air, capturing every humiliating second. "You're making a mistake. I'm a lawyer. I know my rights." "What's the charge?" she demanded, though the steel digging into her wrists made it hard to focus. The bearded officer didn't flinch. "You fit the description of a robbery suspect from this morning." Her mind raced. "A robbery? I've been at home preparing for work all morning." "Check the cameras. We'll figure it out downtown," the taller officer replied dismissively. She swallowed the heat rising in her throat. "Don't cry. Not here." "Someone call my brother," she hissed through gritted teeth. "He'll handle this." "He can meet you at the station," the bearded officer grunted, guiding her roughly toward the door. As they dragged her outside, a voice cut through the stunned crowd. "She didn't do anything. She just walked in." Amara twisted her head. A young black woman, barely out of her teens, stood near the register, phone shaking in her hand as she filmed. "Stay out of this," the officer barked. Amara's jaw clenched. You should listen to her. But they didn't. The morning air hit her like ice as they pushed her toward the waiting squad car. Her blood pounded in her ears, but she steadied her voice for one final attempt. "Do you even know who I am?" she said coldly. The bearded officer snorted. "Yeah, the suspect." "No, I'm Amara Bennett. My brother is U.S. Attorney General Marcus Bennett." Time slowed. The buzz-cut officer blinked. The bearded officer's smirk faltered. For a moment, there was a crack in their certainty, a shadow of doubt, but it was too late. "Big mistake," Amara whispered, before they shoved her into the back seat. Chapter 2: Viral Outrage. By noon the next day, the video had gone viral. News anchors dissected the footage, while hashtags like hashtag Justice for Amara and hashtag in racial profiling trended across social media. Headlines blared from every major network. Attorney General's sister wrongfully arrested. Chicago PD faces scrutiny. Civil rights lawyer cuffed without cause. Officers under investigation. Nationwide protests erupt following viral arrest video. Amara sat in her office, scrolling through her phone. The video, filmed from multiple angles, had racked up millions of views in hours. Her inbox overflowed with messages. Civil rights activists, journalists, politicians. But it wasn't the media circus that consumed her thoughts. It was the injustice. A knock at the door snapped her from her thoughts. Marcus stood there, his tailored suit immaculate, but his eyes dark with restrained anger. "You broke the internet," he said, his voice low. "Good," Amara replied. He closed the door and sighed, pacing the room. The mayor's scrambling. The police chiefs already on damage control. They put the officers on administrative leave. "With pay, I bet," Amara cut in, her voice bitter. Marcus hesitated. "For now, there's going to be an investigation." She scoffed. "Yeah, I know how those go. Internal reviews that end with nothing. I'm not waiting around for that. I'm filing a class action suit. Not just against those two idiots. The whole damn department." Amara. "No. Enough's enough. I want systemic change." Chapter 3. Fighting the System. Within a week, Amara's legal team filed a massive lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department, citing systemic racial profiling, wrongful arrests, and civil rights violations. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who'd been silenced by a broken system. The public rallied behind her. Protests filled the streets. Crowds chanted her name, wielding signs that read, "Justice for Amara," and "No more racial profiling." News crews camped outside City Hall as the mayor called an emergency press conference. The events that took place were deeply troubling, the mayor read stiffly. The city is committed to a full investigation and long overdue reforms. But Amara wasn't moved. "Words mean nothing without action," she told reporters outside the courthouse. "This is about accountability, real accountability. We can't keep letting this happen." Meanwhile, the two arresting officers, Reynolds and Daniels, were cornered by the media, their attempts at damage control painfully awkward. "We followed protocol," Reynolds mumbled during a televised interview. "It was a misunderstanding. You arrested an innocent woman without checking her ID," the reporter fired back. "That's more than a misunderstanding." The public wasn't buying it. Protesters surrounded the precinct. Social media erupted with calls for the officer's termination. And still, Amara pressed forward. Chapter 4. The Legacy of a Fight. Months later, Amara sat in a packed courtroom as the judge finalized the settlement. A multi-million-dollar payout from the city, the officers fired, and the police department ordered to undergo sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training and stricter arrest protocols. But for Amara, the victory wasn't about the payout. "This lawsuit was never just about me," she told the sea of reporters outside the courthouse. "It was about a system that continues to devalue Black lives. It was about forcing the city to confront its failures. And today, for once, we made them listen." The crowd erupted in applause. Her brother stood beside her, pride gleaming in his eyes. Amara smiled, but it was a hard one. She knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time, the system had been forced to look itself in a mirror. And it didn't like what it saw.